Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar when we're going to be discussing how consumers are shopping in the new retail landscape. My name's Tina Spooner and I work on the Insights team here at the BRC. We're delighted today to be joined by Ciaran O'Malley from Trustly. He's going to be sharing some very interesting insights from their research on consumer shopping habits, both online and also in the physical world. I think it's fair to say that the retail industry has been very resilient throughout the COVID crisis, dealing with lockdowns and reopenings over the past 2 years, and of course it continues to evolve. We've seen new methods of shopping emerge, with more retailers integrating their physical and digital touchpoints more than ever before, and this is very much led by consumer demand as we come out of the pandemic. Consumer mindsets have also changed since the pandemic hit, and we are now in a new normal. More consumers are comfortable making the shift to digital and omni-channel shopping. Ciaran's going to be presenting some key findings from Trustly's consumer research about how people shop. The presentation will be split into 3 sections, which I'll briefly tell you about, but Ciaran will obviously go into a lot more detail. The shift towards digital spending, how consumers' buying intent and motivation impacts their payment choices, the importance of simplicity and transparency. We'll have a brief Q&A after each of those segments, so do please submit your questions and comments via the questions tab at any point during the presentation. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can, time permitting, but any that we can't get through, we'll follow up after the event. We're also going to have a couple of poll questions that Ciaran will be fielding, so really appreciate your participation, which you can easily participate by clicking on the poll tab. So without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Ciaran.
Well, thank you very much, Tina. So today we're going to look into some research Trustly's undertaken into trends and priorities in this new retail landscape. Before we jump into the detail, I thought I should just introduce myself. So I'm the VP of Ecommerce and Financial Services at Trustly. I've been working with Trustly and open banking for over 6 years, and really my focus has been to bring technology of open banking into usable and kind of deliver solutions for merchants' needs in e-commerce and financial services. Prior to that, I worked in financial services at M&A as well. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of Trustly, we've got some high-level details here. Trustly is one of the global open banking and account-to-account players. We currently work across Europe, which is really our home, as well as a fast-growing business in the US, and we're expanding into LATAM and APAC as well. We currently work with around 8,000 merchants, many of whom are very similar to yourselves, and they include the likes of IKEA, the likes of KLM, lastminute.com, in the Nordic specialists like Elgiganten, and retail leaders like Boost. We currently connect to around 6,000 banks, and our real focus is the Nordic markets, but increasingly so the UK. Personally, the UK has been a real journey for me. Beginning this sort of open banking movement back in 2016, and Trustly's really played a part in taking learnings from the Nordics and giving them to the UK regulators to sort of see what's potential and what's possible with open banking. And we're really pleased to see now that the takeoff in the UK, yes, it's sort of nascent, it's starting to move, but with merchants like Wizz Air offering Trustly on the checkout already, we really feel that this is going to move forward. But anyway, enough about Trustly, and you can always reach out to me separately if you'd like to know more about us. So we've been doing we're really obsessed with research and understanding consumers in the broader sense, as well as from a payments perspective. We undertook some research in February this year, surveying 2,000 customers in the UK, and really looking at sort of the in-store and online and the interaction between. We've pulled out 6 major trends in the research that you'll get a link to later today, and we're going to dive down onto sort of 3 of them in the session today. So the 3 topics that Tina mentioned, first off, we're seeing a real shift in shopping habits towards more digital spending, but not necessarily digital browsing. We're seeing buying intent and motivation actually impacting the way in which customers want to pay. And finally, this drive towards simplicity and transparency, it really shows up in data as being more important than ever before. If we start with that first key finding around shopping habits, which are shifting towards the digital spend, again, we're seeing this real trend of physical experiences but converting online, and also capturing how to capture people who are browsing online for an intent of shopping, but also actually almost as a way of passing the time. So to begin this section, we'd like to actually start with a poll, and that should be popping up on your screens on the right-hand side shortly now. And the poll is a very simple question. Do you shop online more or less now than compared to before the pandemic? I'll just answer that myself as well. And I think this is really about, we were forced into a digital first world during the pandemic, and there were pros and cons from that. But we're really starting to look at, okay, is this a permanent shift in customer behavior and need to serve, or is this something that will shift back? So as the poll is coming through, I think I'm perhaps the only one that can see this, so I'll talk you through the results. We're currently seeing, so amongst this group, 61% would actually shop more post-pandemic. About 35% are around the same, and only 4% of you less. Now, when we've asked this question to the broader the population, the 2,000 consumers we surveyed, we found that 60% of those wanted to go back to some kind of physical environment, but a third really wouldn't be shifting away from online. They'd firmly moved from being offline first into being online focused. So I think the key thing here is that to say that everything is shifting online is hugely missing the point. But we are in a world where things have changed, and the online experiences, whilst they were growing, are ever more important now. So in this section, I'm going to dive into some data points we found and try and give some of the context around them. Again, we'll pause for some Q&A and discussion after this first session as well. So 81% of 16 to 24-year-olds will browse in physical stores, but then convert online to try and secure the best price. And that's actually even as high as 66% across the entire population that we surveyed. I think this is really critical here. The idea of us all shifting completely into a digital space is slightly overblown, but this true omni-channel experience where customers will browse, they will interact with your brand, they'll want almost a showroom experience in real life, but then they will check that purchase. They will actually pause and think, can I get access to that product or service for a better price online? So I think this really drives the importance of having brand loyalty and commitment to the brand. I think this is perhaps most challenging for those in the retail space who are selling more commoditized products. This really is kind of a key challenge that will need to be faced. And again, driving that value of uniqueness, brand loyalty, and the experience in store. If we then look at, we always try and dive behind these stats. And again, the key factors driving the shift to an online shopping experience, the first one being more convenient. I think we can all agree there are certain key convenience drivers. But more choice, I think, is a particularly interesting one as well. You know, the fact that consumers believe that there's a broader array of products available, whether that be product variations, sizing, etc., or it may be a wider choice of types of product. But price is also a key aspect here that's driving this online behavior. Again, 38% using the online channel to try and find cheaper pricing. If we then look at the dimension of the categories, it's not as straightforward, again, and this is a key theme here, that it's not a straightforward shift. We're seeing a really strong shift in fashion and technology. I think this perhaps wouldn't surprise many, particularly given the way online fashion has grown so quickly over the last few years. And again, technology is largely providing products that can be bought from multiple places, single products from multiple vendors. On the other hand, if we look at the converse of this, groceries and alcohol have a real strong preference to be actually in the physical space. So it's not to say that all types of online shopping are shifting across. We're really seeing fashion, technology, books is around 50% preference, and hobbies is another high preference area. But again, the category is critical to understanding how that preference is shifting. I think it's really easy to wish away or undermine the actual importance of being in a store, being in a more social environment, and actually interacting either socially with a brand, so whether that be speaking to the people in the business, the staff at the store, or actually with a group, whether it's family and friends, and jointly experiencing that shopping experience. So again, within the shift to digital, it is critical to remember that the behaviour of going to a shop and trying products, being impressed by the experience, customer service, that has not evaporated. But you have to then be conscious of the fact that the actual purchase, the conversion, may shift to a digital experience. We're seeing some retailers trying to sort of take that on the front foot and offering QR codes next to the products, so customers can then maybe see detailed reviews, and that's something we'll come back to, or actually make the purchase in a digital environment to perhaps be able to sort of benefit from delivery, or try and capture that different payment method that the customer may want to use. So again, critical insight that we're really pushing here is that the store isn't disappearing, but it needs to be blended into the digital experience. Finally, the last kind of insight of this section, and one that I find really, really fascinating, is that 26% of those 16 to 24 effectively use shopping online as a hobby, as a way of passing the time. It's entertainment as opposed to necessarily something with really strong buying intent. If we then look at the other end of the demographic scale, those in the sort of 45 to 55 and over, that drops to 10% and below. So there is a real opportunity, but also a challenge here. The opportunity being that you're getting eyeballs onto your site, you're being able to engage these customers, but they have a much weaker buying intent. They're effectively browsing to sort of pass the time. So clearly that gives you an opportunity, but also potentially traffic that isn't converting immediately. The highlights from this section, this part of our report, are really that the casual shopper is a critical area, and if you can convert those casual shoppers, you'll really drive significant value. That the offline experience is not dead, but you need a seamless experience to move customers from a sociable shopping experience in store into an online experience where they may convert. And finally, this may change how you need to think around your operations, and we call out refunds and returns as something that is changing from previously before. And on that, Tina, perhaps I'll hand over to you to kick off with your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Ciaran. Very interesting, very interesting. And I think that the first thing for me that came out of that was from the research was some of the categories you mentioned there that are more where consumers are more likely to buy online. It ties in very much with the data that we're seeing at the BRC as well. So, for example, we all know that online penetration rates soared during the pandemic. I think we went from around 30% online sales penetration to 70% and higher. What we are seeing now is that penetration rates for each categories are settling down, but we are actually seeing that the higher sort of ticket bulky items, as you'd expect, are staying quite high. So things like household appliances and larger home items, we're seeing around sort of 50-60% penetration. And categories such as health and beauty, so items where there's more of a need to feel, touch and smell, we're seeing sort of less than 20% penetration. But I would say that most categories are higher than we saw sort of pre-pandemic. I can't see any questions coming in yet, so just a reminder to everyone: do feel free to submit your questions. We'll be happy to answer them if we can. And I guess the other thing is around the sort of seamless omni-channel experience as well, Ciaran. And I know that we've seen a lot of investment from retailers in integrating their systems to sort of create that seamless experience. And I think one couple of stats that I've seen recently are around the sort of value of omni-channel or multi-channel shoppers, and I'm wondering if this is something that you've seen as well. But I think it's around the average omni-channel shopper I've read is worth spends around 60-70% more than a physical only shopper.
And I think this kind of really makes sense in the context of the number of touch points. If a consumer is engaging with you in a physical store and then a later point or a different point engaging with you online, you really have a stronger relationship with that customer than someone who just casually passes into the store, maybe has a quick browse and wanders on to the next. So while there are clearly costs in moving to an omni-channel setup from being before, I think that engagement, and this is the key thing for me, particularly with price competition across online products, to be able to build stronger engagement and that brand loyalty, multiple touch points. For me, that's where the sort of leaders in the industry are moving.
Now that ties in nicely to a question that's just come in. So when shoppers are converting from shop to online to get the best price, is it driven by discount codes? Is that something you've seen in your research?
We haven't seen that directly come out, but we didn't ask a question on that. So that's perhaps why.
Yeah.
But I think that is the key point. And we're in a stage now where even Google Mail is picking out discount codes directly from emails and giving them to shoppers on a plate without them necessarily having to actually open the email. So I do feel that discounting and some of the practices to sort of drive volume to sites are definitely being picked up by a proportion of the population. Again, within this though, it is key to note that whilst price may be an important factor, it's not necessarily the only factor for some of those consumers.
Right. I think we've got time for one more question before we move on. Of the third who you said would remain more online focused in the future, why? What do we know about them? Any thoughts?
I would go back to that then. Why do they want online shopping? And they're really that convenience. I think 73% of customers driving convenience. And within convenience, we see ability to browse. Again, having the ability to shop when they want to without necessarily having to move into a physical space. But also delivery and returns are seen as a real driver of the convenience factor. So I think that within that space, those shifting across, they're really being driven by convenience primarily, and then, as we mentioned before, the breadth of offering and cost as well.
Okay, great. So when you're ready, perhaps we can move on to the next segment.
Perfect. Okay. So again, this is a really fascinating area around buying intent and motivation actually impacting payment method choices. And the sort of key aspect to this is really buying intent differs quite significantly within the demographic groups we saw. So product need is clearly, and I guess perhaps one of the easiest to understand. And we see a real difference here between sort of the 16 to 44. For product need, we don't see a difference. We see a pretty continuous first or second ranking across age groups, but really driving most and being considerably more important for those in the 55 plus area. So I need the product is still fundamentally the driving motivation influence, which I think is probably a good thing. Then when we start to look into sort of some of the other areas, I find it really fascinating, the importance of reviews and the difference, again, between the different demographic groups. So what you can see is in the 16 to 34, and to some extent into the 44 category, really reviews are driving customer behavior. You're largely being motivated by seeing positive reviews, whereas as we look into the older demographic, actually that's less important a factor. Now, if we take a step back and think about that physical versus online experience, it's actually relatively challenging to get reviews into the store. Of course, there are ways of doing that, but I think it's potentially an interesting space for retailers to be able to use some of this omnichannel. Again, I mentioned QR codes before, so that customers, particularly in the younger demographic, can really see, okay, actually, this is a product that I want, and there are 30, 60 different reviews explaining why this has been a great purchase, or perhaps not. Another kind of, I think, kind of interesting difference that we've seen across the groups is around the importance of ease of use on site. So if we look at the ease of use, marginally higher importance, the sort of older end of the spectrum as well, which perhaps we would expect to see. And then I guess perhaps the last one to comment on is impulse buying, which, connecting back to the previous stat we had around people in their 16 to 24 age group, using online shopping as almost an entertainment form, you see that effect again here with those being sort of motivated through impulse buying, again in the younger generation, whereas it's a pretty small factor as we move out towards sort of 45 plus. So again, needing the product and quality of the product is obviously critical, but the importance of reviews is really something that we see kind of moving through the generations, and I think something really critical to take away from the buying influences. If we look at actually what's motivating a customer to buy and then their choice of payment method, we see a really interesting difference. So those wanting something versus needing something tend to pick a different form of payment. Around 72% of customers who are buying something they need, they will prefer to use a debit payment method, i.e. they'll prefer to pay with money that they have in their bank account rather than using credit. Debit is still the primary payment method, again, for things that they want, so perhaps more discretionary purchases, but clearly it's a lower rate at 58%. So debit is really driving, or it's the key payment method for purchases where customers have need or perhaps even highest conviction. Whereas credit is more around purchases where customers have maybe lower conviction or perhaps don't necessarily need the product as much, as well as obviously the financing benefit of credit. So I think this has a really interesting impact for sort of kind of difference across the different sectors, because we can see here that debit payments are particularly driving preference, or being preferred rather, for clothes and subscriptions. You see a slightly lower rate there with technology, which we believe is the mix shifting a little bit more to financing. So while a customer may want something and want to pay with debit, the financing aspect of credit is obviously important there. But again, a very consistently high rate across home, garden, beauty, sports, leisure, hobbies, etc. So I think what's really critical to draw from this is that debit, the choice of payment method, and particularly choice between debit and credit as categories, is driven by buying intent, and it's relevant across different categories, with some variation, as you can see here. But perhaps the shift to credit that has been sort of pushed and publicised with buy now, pay later, perhaps overestimates some of the true buying preference here. And again, if you're looking at how your checkout needs to adapt, it's really important that, or what we've really seen and the importance going forward, is that the sort of old world of just having debit and cards accepted is really starting to pick up. In Europe, we tend to see around 48% of consumers wanting to pay with some alternative method. And we're starting to see now in the UK that shift coming across. So of course we have e-wallets, we have vouchers, direct payments or bank payments, buy now, pay later, as well as store credit. So the key insight to draw from this is that your checkout needs to be able to adapt between different buyer behaviours. And while certain payment methods may attract particular groups or particular motivations, there really isn't one payment method anymore to sort of solve all of your potential customers' needs. Again, just to focus in on bank payments, given Trusty's background in this, we really see this as an extremely high growth area, being meant primarily for merchants wanting to access some of the more merchant-based benefits, but also the customer experience becoming a single fingerprint or face ID in the UK. So we really expect to see the bank payment aspect eating into that debit share, particularly from debit cards. Finally, just on sort of factors driving choice of payment method, again, there is a really clear winner here, and security is critical actually across generations. Yes, it is most important to those in the 55 plus bracket. However, you can see that it is the most important across every single age group. So I think that's something that perhaps we may underplay sometimes when we're looking at motivations. Maybe we think about branding, we think about other aspects, but security being the key area driving payment method choice. Another important difference that we've seen here is that buyer protection is really critical with an older generation. However, we don't see that represented anywhere near as highly in the 16 to 34 category. It's still an important part of it, but it's much less important than overall security. Again, benefits are an area that we're seeing less and less, and we have a slightly inconclusive result here. I think loyalty and particularly sort of rewards points, whilst being huge in the US, in the UK they have a group that are keen, but they're really not driving preference and payment method choice in the same way as security and other factors. Finally, something that I found really fascinating and something that we see actually a difference in real life or in our experience is the impact of retailers recommending and putting methods to top of checkout. So here you can see that it's typically those two aspects are amongst the lowest of all the reasons pushing to a customer to choose a particular payment method. We do see, though, in cases where merchants have tried to shift volume from one payment method to another, it has been done extremely effectively by recommending certain payment methods and the positioning of the checkout as well. So perhaps that's something that customers are not willing to admit affects their choice, but it's definitely something that we see in practice having quite a significant impact. So to bring this section to a close, it's really, I think, the key insight from the motivations and the payments aspects of this research is that you need balance on a checkout. You need to be able to satisfy those with a strong need for a product and wanting to pay with money they have, as well as offering the ability for customers who perhaps don't have such a high conviction or in the want side. Definitely in the UK, we are adapting to the sort of more European approach of having more and broader payment methods, and it's really part of a healthy checkout moving forward. And again, if you're trying to get ahead of trends, seeing those trends that are moving between particularly, I would say, the 16 to up to sort of early 40s group are really going to determine what the face of the checkout will look like for the next 30, 40 years. And with that, Tina, any thoughts on that research?
Yeah, thanks, Ciaran. Again, very interesting. I'm thinking about the buying intent by demographic. So I guess the impulse buying, the emotions in Instagram, you'd expect to be more important for the younger demographic. I guess no surprises there. I think around the reviews, slightly surprised that it's mostly the younger demographic that would rely on the reviews. I would have thought there would have been a more, not a shift, but more evenly distributed among the older demographic as well. But that's not something that came out from the research, is it? Unless I've misunderstood.
No, No. So really, the impact of reviews was really at that younger generation.
Okay. Oh well, I'm in that younger group then, I think, because that is important to me. Okay, we have a question here. What is the penetration rate for buy now, pay later and store credit at a general level? Any idea on that?
Well, we didn't go into sort of detail on splitting out these hugely. I think actually, if I pop back to one of my slides that you can see in the background here, hopefully you can see that now.
Yep.
Oh, payment method choice. Here we go. So we've given the sort of approximates here in terms of preference. We haven't given the exact numbers. I believe those are either in the report or we can come back to you with them. I think what's kind of key within the buy now, pay later kind of question is that the customers are seeing it as a different area from credit cards and store credit currently today. I think it is seen as a separate branded option, while perhaps we were talking about this at an event this week around how actually invoice payments have been around for over 100 years, and it's sort of an established part before the kind of modern buy now, pay later came forward. I think, again, on this topic, what's really, really key for us is the fact that while buy now, pay later may have expanded recently, actually the key sort of, purchasers who really have a core need for something are still on looking at for debit options and purchasing through debit rails, which I think is something that perhaps sometimes is understated. One of my colleagues has just let us know that 19% for buy now, pay later and 22% for bank payments were the numbers that came through.
Great, thanks. And, you know, I mean, we're seeing more retailers offering buy now, pay later for, you know, at the checkout. And, you know, with the cost of living crisis and incomes being squeezed ever more, is it fair to say that we're likely to see more uptake in buy now, pay later over the coming months?
It's a really interesting dynamic. How does the kind of macroeconomic aspect influence? I would say that one of the most important things as a real general point in being able to optimize payment mix is that you always need to have a bit of both, because people's situations are different across one to the other. We do, though, tend to see that in a time of downturn, people will tend to shift towards debit where they can to achieve that control of finances. And definitely in a recession, the kind of the sort of narrative coming from the media around controlling your finances really then pushes customers to think, okay, I shouldn't spend beyond my means. However, clearly, in such a situation, there are also consumers who need credit to be able to make purchases that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. So I think that the key thing is, I would expect, again, we always highlight the fact that debit is perhaps an underrepresented payment method in terms of people's view of the checkout versus, as you can see with the numbers here, over 70% for purchases that people need. And I think that we will see some shift towards debit in the coming 6 to 12 months, even beyond that long-term trend.
Great, thanks. And we got another question here. Are any of those motivations and influences different by socio-economic or affluence level?
We didn't dive into that, and that's definitely something that we will pick up in. I think someone else asked around, will we repeat this in 6 to 12 months? Mm-hmm. The idea with these surveys is they clearly become more and more interesting as we see the time trends, and also to be able to dive into that. So I definitely think that, again, if you look at the result around electronics and the preference for technology, you see a slightly below the average for debit. And clearly that has something to do with affluence, the ability to afford those larger expenditures. And you're slightly below the sort of 70% that you saw for all of the other categories.
Great. And I think maybe just one more before we move on. Are we seeing an increase in appetite to accept cryptocurrencies as a form of payment method?
It's a really interesting one. I think perhaps cryptocurrency is one of those things that, whilst there's a huge amount of focus and kind of speculation around it, we don't really see it entering into the actual mainstream ways of paying. If you look at how crypto tends to work for sort of retail payments, you really have two choices. You can either pay with sort of floating Bitcoin, for example, which has real price volatility, or stable coins. The stable coins that are pegged towards a particular sort of currency, so $1 it may be. I think one of the interesting areas from a crypto perspective is it's very complicated to make a crypto payment. And if I need to buy something, or even if I want to buy something, it's much easier to simply click and fingerprint in your bank app and have that payment done automatically than go onto an exchange, convert into a stable coin, and then pay with the stable coin afterwards. So we don't really see crypto payments as being a significant driver for retail. Perhaps we can see it in the remittance space and place where you're trying to move across currencies. But really, our view is that the trend for retail is about simplicity and moving to a space where a customer pays effectively by proving their identity. So with a Face ID or fingerprint and as few taps as possible. Crypto perhaps has a long way to go before it can kind of claim that level of convenience.
Okay. So yeah, I think we should probably move on to the final segment, if that's okay.
Brilliant. Okay, so the final sort of grouping of trends that we saw were around simplicity and transparency, and those being always important, but in this case more important than ever before. We were really interested in what type of experience it causes a customer to actually not want to shop again. You know, what is driving, or where can you potentially lose a customer? And you see two really strong trends in the demographics here. The first being that delivery is absolutely critical for the 16 to 44 demographics, and is the key way that you could potentially lose a customer if you can't deliver on delivery. On the other hand, we see this real strength in the sort of, I'd say 45, but really in the 55 plus demographic, that actually nothing would really put them off from working with or from purchasing from a retailer before. This is something that we'd really like to dive into kind of follow-ups, but from my kind of view on this is that the older generation perhaps are purchasing from businesses that they already have trust in, and they want to purchase certain items from those retailers. And so they are far more sort of sticky and committed. Whereas on the other hand, the younger generation being more willing to try new retailers, new products, and really judge them on that first performance, I think is a key factor here. So again, you see delivery, but also the quality of product being the key things that would put off a customer from purchasing again. Secondly, we see this trend, or the sort of third trend that I'd like to sort of pick out here, is again the emphasis on reviews. You can see that reviews are around sort of third, joint fourth most important for 16s to 24s, but that really tails off as we get into the 45 and 55. So from approximately kind of a third of customers being put off by reviews, down to almost as low as 10% for the over 55s. Again, we would love to dive into that a bit more. My kind of speculation on this and my thoughts are that this is really being driven by customers shopping from known and sort of understood and trusted brands versus customers being more willing to kind of try new businesses and new sites. So this is again a really interesting area around the friction on sites. So we found across all demographics that a third view inputting card details as one of the biggest frustrations when shopping online. If you kind of step back and think about just how seamless many retail experiences are online, a customer has been able to perhaps watch video of a product, view reviews, they've been able to select delivery, they've been able to move through this experience in either by click and point, or with things that they perhaps really know off by heart, like your address. And then at the end of the checkout, they face this sort of panic of, right, what's my card number, and having to sort of type in 16 digits to be able to go through that final aspect of the shopping experience, which for us really sort of seems that perhaps because the rest of retail and online shopping is really becoming so smooth, you're seeing that this sort of card detail is becoming a real frustration point at the end of the experience. I, for one, are constantly losing debit cards, so really struggle with that aspect. Again, focusing in on the payment frustrations here, we really see that remembering passwords and inputting card details are those top payment frustrations. And unfortunately, the password aspect covers e-wallets that require a password, as well as sort of the inputting of card details. Surprisingly to us, waiting for a payment to go through whilst having sort of 20% frustrations, we would have thought that perhaps that was actually one of the most frustrating aspects. So it is really quite, I think it's about what the customer needs to do. And the customer being asked to enter something that they either don't have with them or can't remember seems to be a more frustrating experience than if there are delays or the payment not necessarily processing as quickly as they would like to. So it seems that requiring a customer to do something is a more painful experience than perhaps the shop being slow to confirm the payment. Again, if we look at kind of the importance of speed and that end of checkout aspect, we see that really retailers sort of have around 2 to 3 minutes to convert someone. So once on checkout, so it needs to be fast, but it doesn't need to be absolutely instant. An experience taking 2 to 3 minutes that satisfies the need for security and perhaps is able to deliver an experience without manual entry will really kind of fit all the different needs here, rather than it having to be below 30 seconds. And on that, we wanted to do a final poll before our last stat. So hopefully you'll see a poll popping up now. And the question is very simply, how many times would you try to pay before abandoning a checkout? So if your preferred payment method doesn't work, how many times would you try again before you actually abandon the store? Again, I'll just vote for myself there. Okay, interesting. So the group online today is actually really representative of the overall result that we saw. So 83% of you would try twice, but only 13% would try 3 times. Only 4% would try once. And really kind of chime with what we saw in the research. So we call it kind of 2 strikes and you're out, effectively. So 43% would try 2 different payment methods. A third, so perhaps a slightly more higher bar with our consumers here, would only try once, but only 10% would try a 3rd time. So really, you have some play with the first and the second payment method, but if that second payment doesn't go through, you're likely to lose the consumer. I think, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but in a world of SCA, you're seeing that first-time payment attempts are being declined at a much higher rate than ever before. This research at least gives you comfort that you can try a backup payment method. You can offer supporting methods to try and capture a customer and have a high likelihood of them coming through. Similarly, it also means that if you want to change the payment mix, you can try and push other payment methods, and most customers will still fall back to secondary if they weren't able to pay with the first. So I think this is a good result for retailers, that customers will give them 2 chances. So to bring to a close the payments aspect of this, it's really, really critical in the store that the checkout doesn't become a roadblock to conversion. Customers really are interested in security. They are willing to give you an opportunity if the first payment doesn't go through, but you really need to, if it gets to that 3rd payment failing, you're in trouble, or when you're likely to result in a customer and not converting with the store. So again, from this side, really security being the key factor, driving payments preference with this. Okay, well, Tina, thoughts on that data?
Yeah, thanks, Ciaran. So yeah, I would try twice. I did think about once, but no, I think I would try twice. But actually, 2 to 3 minutes, I would have lost my patience if we're approaching 3 minutes to try and get a payment through. So clearly, I'm not that tolerant. But you know, it got me to thinking that when a consumer has a great experience with a brand, and I include payments in this, you know, not just the products, the ease of use, but you know, specifically that and payments, their expectations are only heightened for the next interaction. And whether that's with your brand or another retailer, that is where they set the benchmark. So I think, you know, you're absolutely right. There's a short window for getting it right, and those retailers that don't are likely to lose their customers for the payments reasons as well. Got another question here. Are any frustrations evidence in the research in new online security requirements, or is it just me?
A really interesting question. This research was done just before SCA took hold, and we are seeing anecdotally that there are a lot of frustrations around the way in which SCA is done. I think they fall into two brackets, to be frank. What first bracket is retailers not being able to actually handle SCA because of clearly soft declines and other aspects. The secondary being that the customer is frequently having to, in some cases, still use one-time passwords, some age-old authentication methods, or the fact that they're having to sort of manually go through into their online bank to verify the payments. So we are seeing some drop-off. A lot of retailers are using Trustly Open Banking as a backup to that because we have an automated flow where a customer is able to go through that strong customer authentication, but with the app popping up immediately on their phone or scanning the desktop from a desktop experience, scanning a QR code. And again, that bank experience being immediate and biometrics driven. So we are definitely seeing disruption from checkouts that may have been high performing before, needing to either consider new payment methods or consider backup payment methods. And that's why I think the fact that a customer gives you two chances is really quite important. Yes, it's brutal because if that second one doesn't work, they will probably abandon. But you can use other payment methods to support your mix and make sure that you get conversion.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's all of the questions I can see at the moment. If there are any more, please submit them. We've got a few minutes left. If anyone has any more questions, comments, observations.
Well, I think we've had some really interesting ideas coming through in the questions to actually build on this research, and that's definitely what we're interested in doing. You'll receive the long form of this as well as these materials after the end of the session. And if you have any questions or any thoughts or you would like to understand more about Trustly, please do reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you.
Okay, so I think with that, we'll probably wrap up. Ciaran, thank you so much. I think it's been really insightful. Good questions, good conversation. As Ciaran has said, you will receive a copy of this presentation after the event, and you'll also be able to download the report. And do please feel free to get in touch with either Ciaran or myself if you have any follow-up questions or would like to discuss further. And with that, thanks very much, everybody, for joining, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tina. Have a good day.